On Thursday, Lia Thomas, who is trans, won the NCAA championship in the 500-meter freestyle swimming event. The victory was marred and continues to be marred by the debate around her competition and her ability to compete in these events. Here to discuss what Thomas's victory means for the sport and the future of trans athletes in sports is Katie Barnes, award-winning journalist for ESPN. Katie, welcome to Takeline.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Tell us about what essentially are the objections to Lia's competing in these events.
Lia, unfortunately, sort of stepped into a bit of a perfect storm, where we're having an ongoing national debate about transgender people, generally speaking, and a lot of that debate is focused in sports, and particularly around transgender women competing in women's sports. And so for Lia Thomas, the core of much of the criticism that she receives is rooted in the fact that prior to swimming on the women's team at the University of Pennsylvania, she spent 3 seasons on the University of Pennsylvania men's team, though it is worth noting that one of those seasons she had begun hormone therapy. So the fact that she was already competing on a relatively elite level, meaning Division I athletics, on the men's side, and then transitioned to compete on the women's side, and transitioned after going through testosterone-driven puberty. And so all of those things together have really created a controversy around the science when it comes to transgender inclusion in women's sports, and what is fair, what is unfair, and whether or not she should be allowed to compete. Although it is worth noting that she did satisfy all the rules and policies put in front of her.
And also, she came in 5th in the 800 and last in the 100. It's not like Lia was out here dominating the field in every single race she competed in. It's very interesting to me that the way this conversation is often framed is like, people are like, they're okay. They profess to be fine with trans athletes competing, but they clearly are not fine with them winning. Do you think that is the case here?
Oh, there's no question about the fact that when it comes to how we talk about transgender athletes, the ones that we focus on, the names that we know, are all of those who win. Right. There are plenty of athletes that have competed, for example, at the high school level, whose names we will never know. But instead, we've heard of the runners in Connecticut, Andrea Yearwood and Terry Miller, who won state championships, and they are transgender girls, right? And that same principle applies to Lia Thomas. And I think you can point to the fact that, when we first learned about Lia Thomas, it was because she put up, really good times in the 200 and the 500 free at the Zippy Invitational all the way back in December. And when that happened, there was a lot of fervor around the idea that, oh my God, if she's swimming this fast in December and is within 10 seconds of Ledecky and 2 seconds of Missy Franklin, she could beat those records. And so what was interesting at the NCAA tournament was to actually see a lot of those questions be answered in terms of what does it look like when Lia Thomas would swim on an elite level, competing for national championships. And the reality is she wasn't the most impressive swimmer in the pool. Actually, that went to Kate Douglas from UVA. So
you talked about the requirements that Lia needed to fulfill in order to compete. Could you tell the audience what those were?
Yeah, I think there's a misconception around transgender women and women's sports in particular, where it's like this idea that, you could just decide to be a woman one day and then compete immediately.
Just right. So a very simple decision. And why didn't you make it sooner?
Exactly.
You should have made why didn't you do this earlier instead of pussyfooting around and like dragging your feet?
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. It's not like it's a hard internal question or anything.
Right.
So, I think but there is that fear that this boundary, if we blur this boundary between, sexes and between genders, then that also means that it's going to be very permeable. People are going to be able to move back and forth with ease. And that's not actually the way that the policies have been developed. And so for Lia Thomas, for her to compete in the women's category at the beginning of the season, what she needed, the policy at the NCAA was essentially that you had to undergo 12 months of testosterone suppression. And it was a policy that was enacted in 2011. It was old policy, but had been governing, NCAA sports for a decade. But then in January, the NCAA came out and said, actually, we are going to kick our policy to the national governing bodies of each individual sport. So we're going to have a sport by sport policy approach, and it's effective immediately. And we don't exactly know what this is going to mean. And so then everybody was like, well, what's USA Swimming's policy? Because that is the governing body for swimming. And USA Swimming updated their policy and came out and said for elite swimmers, and the way that they categorized that is if you are a USA Swimming member, if you are swimming at a designated elite event, which the NCAA Championships is not one, or if you want to be eligible for American records, which starts at the ages of 13 to 14, you have to undergo 36 consecutive months of testosterone suppression and be under a threshold of 5 nanomoles per liter, which that's just your level of free-floating testosterone. For context, previous levels at the international standard have been 10 nanomoles per liter. A typical person assigned female at birth, is under 5 nanomoles per liter. Most are under 3 nanomoles per liter, just for context. And so that was the policy. But then the NCAA said, you know what? We're also not going to accept that in full. And so for Lia to be eligible to swim at championships, she needed to be compliant with the old NCAA standard, which is 12 months of testosterone suppression, and submit a one-time testosterone serum level of under 10 nanomoles per liter within 4 weeks of competition.
I can't help but thinking as you reel off the number of things that Lia needed to comport with in order to successfully compete, that just the conversation around this, I would imagine if I was struggling with my identity, larger issues after that about what I would want to do with my life after transitioning, that even this kind of, seemingly removed, kind of like data-driven, almost like medical conversation would be something that would dissuade people as a kind of like soft barrier to even thinking about getting involved in college athletics if they were transitioning.
Anytime we have policy, of course, there are barriers. I don't necessarily think that when it comes to, when it comes to elite competition, that, barriers are bad. I think there's an ongoing discussion around what policy is appropriate at what level of competition. So, for example, the NCAA has this policy that applies to all divisions of its sports. Well, for Division I, that makes sense. Does it make the same amount of sense for Division III? I think that's an open question, and people are asking those questions around policy. What's appropriate for the NCAA Division I may not be appropriate for high school, and what's appropriate for high school may not be appropriate for elementary school. And certainly what's appropriate for elementary school isn't going to be appropriate for Olympics. But I think what's happening across the country is we're seeing the conflation of those discussions. Mm-hmm. It's possible to have a very serious, nuanced discussion and really dig into all of the different delineations between what people believe. But one, that's not happening on Twitter, obviously. And two,
what?
I know, right? Surprise. Twitter is not the forum for nuance. Who knew? But it's not really happening around this issue in a public sense. And in Atlanta, you could see that, where you had protesters who had one very specific opinion. And then anytime the students and the swimmers were sharing, the student athletes, like when they were sharing their perspective, it was different. It was a little bit more nuanced. It was, I have empathy for Lia and who she is as a person, and I'm trying to focus on my race. And even for folks who perhaps weren't as supportive of Lia swimming in the women's category, they would painstakingly say, well, it's not about, transgender people. Whether or not that holds true, I think is also an open discussion, but all of these issues and nuances are being conflated into the same thing. And that makes it really hard to have a discussion culturally about something that is so complex as this is.
Takeline is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. I want to tell you about the easiest, most fun way to spice up your season. It's Underdog Fantasy and their brand new Pick'em game. Just pick over or under your favorite or least favorite or the player you think is the cutest or the ugliest player stats, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy-to-use website and mobile apps. Pick between 2 and 5 players, and you can take home some cold hard cash. Use code Takeline and get your first deposit doubled. Sign up now with the code Takeline, and whatever amount of money you put in, up to $100, you will get doubled as bonus cash when you make that deposit of $10 or more. Deposit $100, get $100 free. Deposit $98, get $98 free. Deposit $11, you get $11 free. That's how it works. You mentioned the protesters. What was the atmosphere like there in the gym?
Yeah, Thursday, which was the first day that Lia swam, it was really tense. You could feel the anxiety. It was Lia's best event, the 500. She was favored to win. And there were protesters outside from 2 different organizations. One, Save Women's Sports. The other was the college chapter of Concerned Women for America. And they were protests.
Yeah,
they were outside with their megaphones and their bullhorns, and they held a press conference. Barbara Ehart, who is a state representative from Idaho, flew in for that. She wrote HB 500, which was the first bill to be enacted into law that restricted transgender athlete participation in the country. So she was there. And then there was a small group of counter protesters that were Georgia Tech students, actually. And they kind of rallied the troops, as it were, and came out and stood apart. And there were confrontations between the two sides. There's video evidence of some of the Save Women's Sports folks interacting with the Georgia Tech students. I personally witnessed one member of that protest go over across the street and have a really combative discussion argument, I suppose is the best way of putting it. And so it was not particularly friendly, certainly on the first day. And as the week went on, though, inside the pool, everybody just kind of had a collective sigh of relief, and it mostly felt like a swim meet. It was exciting. It was noticeable that Lia didn't receive as many cheers as other people did. That was definitely true. There were a couple of instances where there were boos that were audible. One parent, or maybe not parent, but one person in the crowd yelled cheater before one of her prelim heats. So it was not a particularly welcoming environment per se, but it also wasn't as hostile as I thought it could have been either.
You mentioned the special interest protesting group, Save Women's Sports, Concerned Women for America. I think that the natural kind of inference from the titles of those groups would be women's sports are under siege now by waves of trans athletes that might come and distort the sport. How many trans athletes are there in NCAA sports?
Well, that's hard to answer. I will say that in Division I women's sports, Lia Thomas is the only known transgender woman who's competing.
Right.
Her career just ended.
Right. Out of
thousands.
Yes. So would it be fair to say that this particular issue, and not just within sports, because clearly I think this is this dynamic is taking place in the broader conversation around the relationship this country has with trans people. Clearly, this issue is being magnified in terms of the actual impact on the sport. Would you say that that's in terms of the fairness for other athletes, if you want to frame it the way that some of these protest groups would frame it? This is, as you just said, the one known trans athlete in this sport has just exited the sport. So we're done, right? We're good? Are we good?
Well, no. I mean, I think those people who are opposed to transgender women competing in women's sports would argue that, okay, it was one athlete, but look at what one athlete was able to achieve. Look at how many spots and opportunities she took away from cisgender women. That is the argument that would be made. I do think it's fair to say that when it comes to transgender women and girls who win, they receive disproportionate coverage, which I think in turn makes it seem like a bigger issue than it is, in terms of just the numbers of transgender women and girls that are participating in sports. Like, we know that those numbers are minuscule. Even if, we took the most generous statistics and interpreted them at the high school level, there would be like, if you do the math, it's possible statistically that there would be like 35,000 transgender athletes. There are not 35,000 transgender athletes, but for argument's sake, let's say that is the number that exists. Well, there are 8 million high schoolers that can participate in sports. So when you do that math, that's 0.44%. And so, and then likely it's actually probably a fraction of that percentage. Because for so many reasons, it's hard for transgender kids to start playing sports. Once you become a high achieving athlete and realize that you are trans, it is hard to continue to compete. You have to make decisions about your career. And I think the other side of that coin is Isaac Hennig, who's a Yale swimmer. He's a transgender man. He has continued to participate in the women's category. Because he has not started hormone therapy. That's how he's able to remain eligible. And he has to make a decision between how he's going to compete and, what his career is going to look like moving forward, as, a guy in women's swimming. And so, trans athletes are constantly confronted with these questions. Never mind the fact that, we're still talking about trans men and trans women when we have an increasingly large number of people that are identifying in gender expansive ways and fluid ways. Like, what does a sporting apparatus that's built on a binary that is committed to having hard lines between those binary categories, what does that look like when not everybody fits that? That is continuing, I think, to pose, just fundamental cultural questions to us as a society. And that's really what we're grappling with. I think one of the reasons why sports has become such a vehicle for this conversation is because of its relationship to gender. It preys on our fundamental cultural beliefs around gender. And that, I think, is particularly confounding for the general populace as, this debate rages on.
Lia's been pretty taciturn, and she's spoken about the impact of the attention on her mental health and how she tries to essentially block things out, but she hasn't spoken that much about her feelings and her thoughts regarding the events. Any idea where her path takes her from here?
She has said that she would like to continue swimming. She would like to swim in the 2024 Olympic trials. Whether or not that happens, we'll see. Policy is a moving target right now, and not just at the collegiate level, also at the international level. There's an expectation that FINA, the International Federation for Swimming, will be releasing some sort of a policy within the coming months because the International Olympic Committee has asked them to do so, asked all of the international federations to develop their own policies. So what that's going to look like, I think, is really interesting. For the better part of a decade, the policies for transgender athletes and eligibility in both the NCAA and Olympic level competition have been sort of settled, like we knew what those were. And that's no longer the case, and they're going to vary by sport. And so what that means for Lia will be interesting. But, moving forward, I wonder if we will hear from her. She hasn't said very much other than a couple of interviews in the last few months. And now that everything is over, maybe we will hear from her, but I don't know. It'll be interesting for sure.
We've been talking with Katie Barnes, award-winning reporter for ESPN. Thanks for joining Takeline.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.